Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here today. This is Nicole with Topaz, and today I'm happy to welcome back Blake Rudis. Hey Blake.
Hello.
Blake is here to show how he's been integrating Topaz Glow into his workflow and show you some tips on how you'll be able to integrate the new program into your workflow as well. I'm very excited about it. He's using it in a very subtle and really impressive way, so I'm excited about the tips he's going to show us here today. With that, let me tell you a little bit more about Blake here. Blake is a Photoshop enthusiast with a very strong fine art background. From painting in front of the TV with Bob Ross as a child to printmaking and sculpture, he has always had a passion for anything creative. He currently has a thing for HDR photography, which you can see here. It's awesome. So you can see more of his images and all of his amazing Photoshop tutorials at everydayhdr.com. You'll get some more links to his information as well later on. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the screen over to Blake in 1 second.
All right, so before I begin, I just definitely want to thank everyone at Topaz Labs, Nicole, the whole group, the whole gang that puts this together. It's awesome that they create such affordable, amazing software, but on top of that, give us a venue to learn from each other. It's really quite incredible what you guys do, so I appreciate that. I guess I can speak from everyone on that point. Today, if you've seen any webinars I've done in the past, you know I'm a really hard hitter on workflow, and I like to start with one image and do a whole webinar on one photograph. But today, I'm going to kind of reverse that. So instead of showing you a workflow in one photo, I'm going to show you how I kind of finish off my workflow now with Topaz Glow. And the thing about Topaz Glow is it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around at the very beginning. We talk about these tools that we have in our Photoshop as tools in our toolbox. And now Photoshop is definitely a hammer. You can't do anything without a hammer. You know, you can build a house with a hammer if you want. But then you get something like Topaz Glow. And a lot of people don't think it's a necessary tool. But if you look at it, it's kind of like a scroll saw. And if you've ever used a scroll saw before, it has a definite place. If you've never used one before, you probably might go your whole life never using one and never having to use it. But when you have one, you can do some really creative things with it. And that's kind of what I'm going with here with Topaz Glow. And that kind of goes hand in hand with Impression because they're very much finishing touch type plugins or programs. So to start this off, I'm going to be talking about my workflow with some of my animal portraits that I take at the zoo. So what you see here is an elephant. This is the after. This is after I've done all of my workflow. This is what it looked like before I went into Topaz Glow, and this is with Topaz Glow. So the way that this is going to work, the first 3 images I'm going to use are pretty much a creative way of using Topaz Glow for what it is. And then the next several images after that are going to be how you can use Topaz Glow and turn it from a scroll saw into something that's an absolute necessity in your workflow. If you've seen any of my most recent stuff since Topaz Glow came out, it probably has a touch of glow in it and you never even know. So the first thing, let's just go ahead and delete this. I'm going to go ahead and delete that one, and the first thing I do anytime I get into a Topaz product is duplicate the background layer. It's not just a Topaz product. Anytime I'm going to do any type of filtering, usually here in Photoshop, actually always here in Photoshop, always duplicate that background layer by pressing Command or Control J. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Topaz Glow. Now before you get too inundated with settings and some of you are probably picking up a pen and you're about to get ready to see what I'm going to do, don't worry about that too much. Actually, I've made a PDF document with all of these example images. So really all you have to do is watch because I want you to pay attention to some of the things that are more important than the numbers. Now, if you want to take notes, by all means, I will not stop anyone from taking notes. I physically can't stop you from taking notes. So if you'd like to take notes, go right ahead. But just know that there's a PDF document that you can download on my website, everydayhdr.com, and that'll be there for you with actual screencasts of those settings on those photos. So don't get too worried about settings right now, okay? So this is typically the preset that I use for animals. It's one of the ones that I've created. Basically, the way I like to use Glow is with this. This is the using Glow for what it is, the fractal stuff that Glow can do. And it's really kind of interesting what Glow can do. So let's just go ahead and take a look at some of those settings real quick. So I'll just go ahead and reset all of this. So if you've never used Glow before, you know you've got a primary glow here and a secondary glow here, and these work hand in hand whether you're using the dark or the light. So I like to just go ahead and start this off with the light, and with the glow strength, that's pretty much going to be what's going to make the effect, of course. So I'll bring that up to about that 0.62 range, 0.63, 0.64. Again, a lot of these things aren't they aren't arbitrary settings. Nothing is really arbitrary. We do things for a reason, but they're subjective to the image as well. So if you see these settings and it doesn't quite work for your image, don't worry about it too much. You'll just go ahead and adjust accordingly. So we'll increase that sharpness. Now, what I really like about Glow is this effect sharpness slider, because if I bring this all the way up, I can get a really crisp, sharp, almost like detail, over-sharpened detail look to the image, and I really do like that, but I'm just going to bring that down, tailor it down for a little bit for now. I'm not going to move Electrify up for this one because what I really do want is that sharp effect. If I move Electrify up, it's going to kind of make everything harsh. And for this photograph, I don't want it to be harsh. I want it to be kind of light and airy so that it looks like the glow effect is actually transitioning into the portrait of the elephant and kind of subduing the rest of the background behind it. So I'll go ahead and leave Electrify alone. So with that simplified details, I'll just go ahead and bring that up a little bit so that it kind of polishes the edges off of some of the effect, because it's going to, like the name implies, it's going to simplify the detail. It's going to kind of blur off those details a little bit. Edge color, I can go ahead and increase that a little bit if I would like to there, and then I'll go ahead and increase that detail strength and the detail size a little bit as well. So there's kind of my before and after with this one. If I wanted to, I could increase the saturation if I wanted some color in there to give it some life to the edge color that I've got there. And I do kind of like that because this was a black and white image, but looking at it, I can actually get quite a bit of color out of that and almost restore the natural color of the elephant skin, which is actually pretty cool. I'll just go ahead and leave that saturation down to the lower area there. I can always desaturate that later since I'm on another layer as well. So then down here with I can either have dark or light selected, and with the light, if I increase that light secondary glow, you can see that everything gets really bright. But then if I go with the dark, we get that darker effect. So this is where you'll see later in my workflow where I use the secondary glow to clean up what I'm doing with the primary glow. So with this, I'll just leave that glow strength down, and I'll actually just increase that effect sharpness. And if you don't increase the glow of it, and you just increase the sharpness of it, you're kind of doing a really strong sharpening to this image. And actually, if you take the glow strength down and increase those effect sharpness on here, you're really just making a really strong, I guess what you could call a high pass sharpen at that point. So just keep that in mind with that effect sharpness, is that that's just an over sharpening of the stuff that exists, and then as you increase that glow strength, it will apply that sharpness to the strength of the glow that you're working with. So I know that might be, it's even a little over my head, but it's just kind of the things that I've come to realize with the software. So if I change that to light, you're going to see you probably won't see too much of a difference here because I don't have a glow strength selected. So if I have the glow strength moved up and I change it from dark to light, that's where you're going to see a difference. So I'll go ahead and leave that at light, and I'll just press OK on this. And this is pretty much good to go. We'll just leave this setting the way it is. Slightly different than what I started with, but like I said, most settings are pretty arbitrary to begin with because it's what happens now that's going to be the interesting part. So here is the original, and here is what I've got now. If you look at this, this is just a fractal elephant, and that's a very artistic looking thing. And this is where I've had several conversations with people about this, where it's kind of hard for them to grasp what the need for glow is, because if you look at it for this sake, if you're not a fractal based artist, you're just a photography based person, this is very graphic in nature. You might use this for maybe some compositing as a background or something of that nature, but for the most part it looks like it has a very small place. But when you see how you can use this later in these next few images, I hope I blow you away. That's the whole intent. So what I'm going to do here actually is make a mask here and just continue on with this, and I'm going to brush with black on the background here. So as I brush with black, I'm using a Wacom tablet. So if you use a Wacom tablet, they're pressure sensitive. It will know what the pressure is that I'm using as I'm using the brush. So if I push really hard, it's going to be really black. If I push really light, it's just going to be gray. But that's kind of the effect that I want now. So the thing about the mask here is I actually want that mask to be pretty much black all the way around. And if you look at that, just for what the mask is, if I press Alt or Option and look at that mask, it's just a black mask that's revealing what's underneath. But if I go into the properties of the mask, I can change the density. So I can bring that density down, and if I bring the density all the way back down to 0, guess what? That mask is now white. If I press Alt or Option on there, it's just a white mask. But as I increase that density, it allows me to kind of blend things a little bit better. And then what I can also do is feather that as well. So I can bring the feather up on that mask, and that will help feather those edges in around the sides of the elephant. And then you can see the before and after that. You can also change the density as you see fit to push and pull that stuff back in. So what we're kind of doing is pushing our background back a little bit, pulling our foreground forward a little bit. And if I press Control Shift and U or Command Shift and U on a Mac, that will desaturate that layer. Now that's a destructive desaturation, because now if I do any other work on top of this, I really can't go backwards. So I'll press Command or Control Z. Another option to do that is to go into the hue saturation, drop the saturation down to -100, press Alt or Option between those layers so that this hue saturation only applies itself to here. Same thing as desaturating, but at this point it's not a destructive desaturation, and I get the ability to pull some saturation back into this. So if I liked some of that orange saturation that I had coming through, I can do that as well. So here's another tip for you when you're doing this fractal type art. If I press Command or Control J, I go to Filter, I go to Noise, and I go to Add Noise. I make that amount about 50 to maybe even 80%. Go to Uniform and Monochromatic and press OK. And then now I apply the Topaz Glow settings to that. I'll just use the exact same settings that I used before. So when Topaz Glow opens up, you're going to see that I get even more intricate and more subtle effects. So the original image that I used here had that subtle glow effect with that kind of gray haze over everything, so that my highlights aren't quite so bright. The thing about highlights in a photograph is that naturally your viewer is going to bounce from highlight to highlight. That's what their eye is going to see. So they're going to bounce from highlight to highlight. These highlights now aren't quite as powerful as they were before. So if I mask this, I'll just do this real quick, just mask that out, and then drop that mask density, and then increase that feather, you can see that we have a little bit more of a compelling photograph than we did before, because now that fractal art doesn't necessarily look like fractals, it just looks like something that the elephant is emerging from. So that's kind of an interesting way to use that. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you how to make some image abstraction. Now, I used to be an abstract painter. I loved abstract painting. So here's the original photograph I started with. Here's the abstraction, and here is what you can do with some of the colors when you use Restyle involved in this. So here I'll just go ahead and press Command or Control J. I'm going to hop right into Topaz Labs and go into Glow. And actually what I'm going to do for the sake of speed here, because I want to get into other things, I'm just going to use those animal settings that I had before. Just click that and press OK. So really what I'm trying to do here is get a nice fractal spread of my photograph, so it's just kind of all over the place. And then what I can do is go to Filter and go to Topaz Labs and go to Impression. And I can use Impression with Glow. And this is great because impression by itself on the photograph isn't going to do the same thing as impression combined with Glow, because whatever you bring into here, whatever input you bring in, is going to have different output. And what I really like about using Glow first is it simplifies the photograph to make it more artistic in the end. So like looking at this, the charcoal setting here, or even the chiaroscuro setting here, colored pencil, now it really does look more like an art piece. So I'm going to go to painting, and I'm going to find this filter by this guy named Blake Rudis called Oil Glaze, and I'm going to use that. Actually, true story, I was in college and I did my final year-end senior show with a gentleman by the name of Rick Davies, who works out of New York now, and he does some amazing oil glaze paintings. And if you've never seen an oil glaze, what it is, it's a buildup of oil paint mixed in with liquid and different varnishes to create a layered effect. And it can take a long time to build this up and to make it look good. And what I really liked was his painting style. I was a printmaker, he was a painter. We complemented each other pretty well. So when it came to using impression, the first thing I thought of was, how can I make an oil glaze effect? And now it's one of my favorite settings there in impression. So you can see there it is, there's the glow, and there's with the impression. So using glow and impression together, you can get a really creative abstract piece. But what if you want to change the colors that are in there, because these are kind of vibrant? Well, that's what Restyle is for. It's basically tonal grading or color grading for your photographs. So using all of what I really like about that abstraction and Restyle is what you can get in the end. Now, what would you use this for? Well, you could print this on canvas. That would be really cool. If you're doing compositing, this would be a pretty interesting composite if, say, we made it this blue and black ice, for example, and pressed OK, and then go to Filter, and then go to Blur, and go to Gaussian Blur. You can blur that so that you get this really eerie looking background, and then if I were to composite a person in this foreground, it would give me a nice little artistic background. So that's an idea that you can use glow and impression together with Restyle to get even more in depth with this image. I mean, just look at the difference there. It's quite compelling. Now you also have your blend options here. If you wanted to, you can change these blending options to whatever you see fit, or you could go to the opacity slider here and drop that opacity and still create something that's pretty interesting. Now look what happens to the background. Those clouds start to become almost painted, and you get this painted look for your natural-looking photo with the artistic effects on top of it. So what you're seeing with this photograph is a finished image. This is already done. I used my digital zone system. I used my color zone system. I used all of my systems. I've spent about maybe 20 minutes building this photograph, and then I put not the icing on the cake, because the icing is really the color zone system for me, but I put the finishing touches. I have a 4-step workflow, and one of those steps is the taking the picture, then your pre-processing, your post-processing, and then your creative process. And this is the creative process. I use glow a lot for the creative process, and you'll see that especially in this photograph. So here we have our third example, and you can see in the background there we've got this nice almost desert picture book sunset. Well, this is what it really looked like. It wasn't the picture book sunset. But using Topaz Glow, Impression, and Remask, I can get that effect. So what I'm going to do is first start off in Remask. So I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Remask. Now, if you're using Remask, it's not necessarily that important to start off with a duplicate layer, because I have it in my settings to create a duplicate layer from my mask. So the way I like to use Remask is to go ahead and paint blue on the tricky areas. So I'm going to paint blue all along this tree. And I'm going to do this kind of haphazardly because for time's sake, I've got a lot of stuff I want to tell you, because this stuff after this image, you're just going to be like, wow. Well, at least I hope so. That's the whole point of all this, right? Okay, so I'll just go ahead and make my brush a little bit bigger. And really all I'm doing, I'm not, with Remask, I don't really concern myself too much with how well I make my blue selection. And the reason why is because the blue is like, hey, all you tricky stuff, where are you? Let me find you. Let me find the tricky stuff first, and then we will we'll make our mask on the tricky stuff after we fill in the easy stuff. So what do I want to get rid of? Well, I want to get rid of all this stuff down here, because I have a clear present blue line here that makes up my whole image. If you have a little gap here, so if I had this gap here and then I were to go ahead and fill this, well, guess what? It's going to fill everything. So press Command or Control Z to go back a little bit, get that blue brush, close that off, and then fill that portion, and then press Compute Mask. I now have a pretty near perfect mask. If I were to clean this up, I would go to my green, and I might just hit the sky a little bit in some of these tricky areas right here. Just all I'm doing is just tapping, just a slight tap in some of the areas that I want to keep. And then on the areas that I want to get rid of, I might make a smaller brush and just tap on those areas that I want to get rid of. And Remask is really good at just selecting those areas out. Now I could get a lot more intricate with this, but I know that the blending option that I'm going to use is going to give me some grace. All right, so I'll just go ahead and press OK on this one. So now it doesn't look any different now. I haven't done anything at this point. But what I'm going to do is go to Filter and then go to Glow first. I'm basically going to do the glow impression that I did before, but then I'm going to give it a, let me go ahead and make some changes here just a little bit. That works. I'll press OK there. So I wouldn't post anything like this. I wouldn't print anything like this. To me, this doesn't really do much for me. But when I go to Filter and I go to Impression, I'll just use that same oil glaze setting. Since it's already loaded, press OK. And then now, since I've got this all segregated, did you see now I've got the background and my foreground separate, I can now go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I don't need to go that far because then I've got nothing. If I go to about, let's say, 6 or 7, anywhere between there is fine. It's arbitrary to the, it's subjective to the image, so 6 or 7, and then change this to hard light. These are blending options. Blending options are really important. Change this to hard light, and look at that. Now I've got that deep sunset that I wanted before, and it's actually closer to what I saw. If it's too much, it's definitely too much down here. I can just drop the opacity a little bit to say something like 70%. And now, since I still have this on a mask, if I press Alt or Option on that mask, I can see what's being affected there. What I can also do is press the / key, and I can get a quick mask. And if I need to fix this mask up a little bit, well, I'm already here. I can do that. So with if I paint with black, I can get rid of more right here. So I'll just paint with black on that area. Get a bigger brush. See what my brush size is. My brush is huge. Okay, so get a smaller brush and just kind of paint out a little bit here. And actually, I'm going to make this, this is a very soft-edged brush. With you can see the hardness is set to 0, so it's a very soft edge brush. And what this allows me to do is just with the very top of this, just kind of feather that area in. And then I'll press that quick mask key again, and now you don't see that red stuff there. Now it's always a good idea when you're working with masking to use that quick mask or use Alt or Option to see what it is that your mask is affecting. So there's the before, and here's the after. And those are all very creative ways to look at this. So now let's look at something a little less literal and something more how you build up the image in order to use glow in a way that you can accentuate a photograph. So this is a built-up image. This is an image I've done a lot of work to get to this point. So what this was 3 exposures that I brought into Photomatics. Really, my settings when it comes to HDR are almost always the same. I'm around f8 with an ISO of about 100. Don't quote me on this. Almost always the same, not all the time. And then I just bring those right into tone mapping, into Photomatics, and then I try to make what looks like a muddy, mottled gray image because that gives me the most to build off of in a 16-bit TIFF. All right. So now you can see with this workflow, I used clarity to make a more compelling photograph. I then sharpened it, and this sharpen setting that I use here, I've got an action for it in the downloads too. So along with the PDF, there's also 2 actions here for right here. It says it right here, insane detail, because it makes insane detail. So if we look at that pole there, this is only set to 40%. If I bring this all the way up to 100%, then that sharpening it's way too much. But the reason why I over sharpen is I bring that sharpening way up to 100%, and then I slowly increase it, or I bring it down to 0% and then slowly increase it until I get the sharpness that I want, and then I'll also mask out. Now, in that insane detail, what it also does is when you press play on that action, it will dodge it'll dodge out or make sure that your shadows are not selected. So your darkest dark portions of your image will not get that sharpening, because if you sharpen the dark areas, you're sharpening that shadow noise, and it just looks really bad. Again, it's a mask. You can add more black to this gnarly looking sky up here that you can see. I've got a lot of dust on my sensor. Okay, and then I used a soft light layer with black and with blue to make this, and then went into Topaz Glow to make this glowing nighttime effect, and then use the contrast checker in the end. So I'll show this whole workflow really quickly here. So duplicate this background layer by pressing Command or Control J, go to Filter, go to Topaz Labs, and go to Clarity. So now within Clarity, the thing about Clarity is I always start with my histogram. I don't even care what the navigator looks like. I don't want to see that. I want to see my histogram. And when I look at the Clarity settings here, I'll just go and reset all of this stuff so that nothing exists in here. When I look at these Clarity settings, I'm paying attention to what's happening to my histogram. And a lot of times I will tell you, let the histogram be the histogram, let data be data. But it's really important when you're working with something like Clarity that's going to do a lot to those little smaller contrast areas to see how it's affecting your histogram. Because just a real quick breakdown of a histogram, this part is your darkest darks, this part is your lightest lights, and then everything in between is going to be everything in between. So if you know anything about the zone system, this is going to be zone 0, and this is going to be zone 10. Okay, So with the micro contrast, I'm just going to bring that up a slight bit. And basically what this micro contrast is doing is it's going to be bringing out the detail in the smallest areas of my photograph, in the smallest contrast areas of my photograph. So if I bring it way up, it's going to look like an overly done HDR photograph, and I would never do that. So I'm just going to bring it up just a slight bit, just a little bit, a little dab will do you, just a little, just enough to get something there, okay? And then bring up the low contrast a little bit. So it's basically a stair step of the contrast and what it's affecting. If I go all the way up, it's going to make a really nasty contrasty image. And when you look at the histogram, you can see that there's a lot of area on that photograph that is now clipped. Those are areas of almost nothing. They don't, those areas don't even exist. I've clipped them so far in those black areas that they're beyond zero. They're beyond zone 10. They're unrescuable. So you don't want to go that far. So we'll just bring that up a little bit in the low contrast. We'll also bring it up a little bit in that medium contrast, so you can see that the areas that it's affecting get slowly larger and larger and larger. All right, so it'd be like imagine micro contrast as a small brush, and then a low contrast as maybe a 500 pixel brush, and then a medium contrast as like a 1500 pixel brush. And as you brush, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and adjusting more and more and more at the same time. So if by chance you increase your medium contrast because you like what's going on with the photograph, but you see some clipping over here, this is where you have the black level down here. This black level, if you move it to the right, it's going to move your histogram to the right. So we get out of that black clipped area and we get more into something that looks good. All right, so there's the before, there's the after. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to manipulate the tones in my image so that I push and pull the highlights and the shadows so I can increase depth in the photograph. There's no depth in this photograph. If you were to sandwich it all together, it would be like a 50% gray image. I want highlights. I want shadows. All right, so if I move that black level to the right, you can see it pulls my histogram to the right. If I move it to the left, it makes all those areas clip even more. So if you never knew what clipping was before, these black ink blot looking things that are happening, that's not good. All right. From an artistic standpoint, you might say yes, it is, but from a data technical standpoint, no, it's not. Okay, so we'll just move that black clipping over until we just reach the very end. Now, do you want some black clipping in your image? Yes, you do want some black in your photo, and you do want some white in your photo because it's very important. So then I can move the midtones to the right and to the left and push the midtone portion of my histogram either direction. So I can make the midtone areas darker or the midtone areas lighter. So I'll make them slightly lighter because I like how it's opening up this photograph a little bit more, and I won't adjust the white level. Another thing that I really like about clarity, and why I'm spending so much time in clarity, is because to me, clarity is almost as important as Adobe Camera Raw. Especially if you don't own Photoshop and you do own clarity, this is probably my favorite Topaz plugin because of the ability to manipulate tone and color. So what I do here is after I manipulate tone, I go into color. So I'm going to start with the luminosity. The luminosity is how dark or light a color is. So imagine you have the color blue. If I add more white paint to that color blue on my palette, it's going to make all the blue a little bit lighter. If I add a little bit more black, it's going to make all the blue a little bit darker. You see how we can start to control depth here with our lights, our tone, and our color. This is where, if you're not saying ooh, ah yet, you should start saying ooh, ah, because I'm even thinking that, like, man, this is cool. I want to do it again. Let me start at 0 and then move down. So now I can also look at some of the other colors in this image. So maybe with the yellows, I can move this is making my yellows lighter or darker. So by making my yellows lighter or darker, it's bringing in some more highlight to those light areas that should be light to begin with. All right, and then we have our purples. Typically, you're not going to find too much purple in a photograph, but this one is a tricky photo because of these little spouts of water here. There's a lot of purple and there's a lot of magenta in there, so I'm actually going to make those a little bit lighter. Typically, you won't find too much magenta or purple in a photograph, but in this one there are, and it makes it very difficult to post-process and get it as natural as you saw it. Because when I saw this naturally, that was white, but it's tricky. All right, so then we can move into saturation. So I can make the saturation of the color blue really bright, or I can make it gray. I'll just make it just a slight bit lighter. And then with the purple and the magenta, you see if I move these down and make them slightly more gray, I can start to get rid of that color cast that's in the water spouts. And then there's hue. So now hue is where you start to shift your color around the color wheel. So here's red. If I move it to the right, the red starts to get a little bit more orange, which does benefit the photo. And then oranges, if I move them to the left, my oranges are going to get more red. If I move it to the right, my oranges are going to get more yellow. So it does benefit slightly by being a little bit more yellow. But now we have our yellows. Do I want our yellows to be a little bit more orange, or do we want our yellows to be a little bit more green? You see how overall saturation is not going to help. Overall hue is not going to help. When you really want to affect a photo and you want to make that photo powerful, you go into the hue, saturation, and lightness of each individual color and make your adjustments accordingly. It's kind of like, have you seen, everyone has probably seen The Wizard of Oz, but remember that part where they go in and their first time at the Wizard of Oz castle in Emerald City, and they say, oh, it's a horse of a different color, and the horse starts changing colors? That's just the hue slider. The hue slider, it's a sky of a different color. It's a color I don't want to see because it's probably post-apocalyptic. So I'll just move that slightly to the right to introduce a little bit more purple into my sky and make it more of a happy nighttime scene. So here's our before, here's our after. So that's just with clarity. Now before we move into the rest of this stuff, it's really a good idea to set your image up for the success to use in something like Topaz Glow to really take advantage of Glow and what Glow can do. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go into my insane detail, and I'm going to press play. And what it's going to do is it's going to open up my document on a new layer. It's going to ask you unsharp mask settings. If you're using a high-res image from a full-frame camera, you can just press OK. If not, you might need to move the amount down a little bit and maybe the radius down a little bit so it doesn't get too sharp in those areas. So you can see if we go way up, it's way too sharp. It's too much because basically what I'm doing here is an unsharp high pass. Yes, I mixed an unsharp mask and a high pass together, and the results are pretty crazy. So then once you press OK, it's going to ask you, how do you want to high pass this? Well, we're going to high pass this at a radius of 0.8. Don't go too high with this because it's going to make it linear light. And linear light, it works really fast and really hard with a high pass. So typically if you use a soft light high pass, you go to 8 pixels. If you're using linear light, stay like under 1, definitely under 1. Press OK, and now it's going to change it over to linear light, and then it's got a series of examples or a series of instructions here for you. If you're using it for the first time, I highly suggest you read this. If you don't want to read it and you just think you're cool, then just press continue. I don't need to read it because I made it. So if I zoom in here, you can see in the directions it says it's default at 100%. So if we drop the opacity down to 0% and work our way up to get the desired sharpness, that's where we want to be. So I'm going to bring that sharpness to about 50. So there we are. Okay. And now, since it opened it up on a new document, I can just press and hold Shift and drag and drop this right onto my original workflow so that it doesn't mess up my original workflow. It doesn't flatten anything. It's non-destructive, and I can get rid of that new image. So now what I'm going to do is play with the blending option. I'm going to play with soft light. So when I go to create a new layer here, it's going to be a clear layer. So what I want to do with this soft light layer is actually paint with black and white. So if you press D for your default palette, and then you can press X to go back and forth. I want to add more drama to this sky, and what I really want this sky to look like, I want this sky to look like I used a neutral density filter. All right. And typically when you use a neutral density filter, the clouds start to kind of create this like conforming, really crazy, eerie look to the inside. It's really cool if you've never used a neutral density filter before. I had one with me. It was in my car about a half mile away, so I didn't want to go back and get it. So what I'm going to do here is just change this to soft light. And if the soft light blend mode, if anything is over 50% gray, it's going to darken the image. If it's under 50% gray, it's going to lighten the image. And it's not going to do it to the point that it ever gets to 100% black or 100% white. So what does that mean to you? Well, if you start painting with black, it's going to add some more drama and some more depth to this image. And I'm just doing these like really quick painting, just really quick lines, just kind of forming right into the center of my photograph, and I'm just going to go back and forth. And this is where you get to be a painter of light and a painter of things that never happened. But you know what? When it's all said and done, no one's going to know you did it. All right? All right. So if we look at that, all it is a couple of black or almost 50% gray squiggly lines. When we turn it off and turn it on, it's adding some depth to our sky. Now, if we make our brush a little bit smaller, we press X to paint with white, it's going to lighten up all of those areas that we want lightened up. So I can lighten up the lights here. I'm turning on those lights. I'm making a little bit brighter here, okay? And I can do that to these little fountain spurts. I can do this to the lights in the background and make them glow a little bit more. See how all this stuff is a build-up, and I'm working relatively fast because of, for time's sake, I would probably be a little bit more cautious about where I was painting, but you can see the difference, all right? So now what we want to do is we want to make a stamp of all of this. So we basically want to make everything we've done here a new layer on top. So I'm going to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E, and that's going to make a new stamp of everything. If you turn the eyeball on and off, you're not going to see any difference. And the reason why is because it's a stamp of everything below. So here is where I'm going to use glow. And I'm going to use glow to make a nighttime glow preset. So you can save that preset if you'd like. The instructions are in the PDF. So if you're just tuning in, there's a PDF document that follows this on my website, and you can get those. Basically, we're going to create this effect. Now, if you look at this, you're thinking, why would you ever do anything like this to your photograph? You have no detail. I have no idea what I'm looking at, and that's where the catch-22 is. We're going to go to our blend mode and go to soft light again, and look at the difference now. It creates a nice, subtle glow. And if you look at this, you can see that what we're using is we're using a black or a dark secondary glow and a light primary glow. So if we go into those settings, you can see here's our light primary glow and our dark secondary glow, and we change this to soft light. That now gives us a beautiful glowing effect to our photograph that if you were to ask somebody or someone were to ask you, they would have no idea that you use a fractal-based program to create a glowing, rich effect. And this is really where everything interesting happens. So how do you do this? Well, you would build up from nothing. All right, so change all your settings, change this to soft light, and then when this is at soft light, that's when you start changing your glow strength. That's when you increase that effect sharpness. That's when you increase that electrify. And all of these settings are basically subjective to the image that you're working with, but I've tried these nighttime settings on a lot of nighttime photos, and they do a really good job. So if you go back to that night glow and we dissect these settings a little bit here, we have our glow strength all the way up. Our effect sharpness is about 0.12. And then we have electrify up to about 1. So if I change this electrify and bring it down a little bit, you can see it gets a little bit more muddy and mottled there. So if I bring that electrify up, we get a more kind of Gaussian blur type effect in our photograph, and it leaves more area and room for that darker area to come in. So the best way to build with this is not to look at the image in that fractal base. Don't look at it in the fractal base. Look at it in the soft light base. So start with that soft light base and then make your settings accordingly. So if we want to bring that electrify down and bring that electrify up, this will give you that ability to see what it is that's happening to your photograph, the detail size, the detail strength, and the brightness, and so on and so forth. So if you're using just Glow as a standalone plugin, I suggest that you use soft light in conjunction with strength here. Okay. If you're using Photoshop, what I would suggest is to go ahead and just bring this into Photoshop as normal, and then press OK. So when you bring it in normally, you can change those blending options right here in the palette. So I can change this to soft light. Oh, that's hard light. It's a little too much. I can change this to soft light, and then I can adjust the opacity as I see fit in between. All right, so I can bring that opacity down if it's too much, or up if it's not enough. Another thing here is if this is now affecting tone and color. If you don't want this to affect tone and color, you desaturate it. Well, how do you desaturate it? Going back to the beginning, you press Command-Shift-U, and that will make that a black and white photo, essentially. If we just press Alt or Option on that, basically kind of looks like a high pass, then we put soft light onto it. Or if you don't want to do it destructively, you go and you create a new hue saturation adjustment layer, drop that saturation all the way down, press Alt or Option in between, and now you have that just affecting the glow layer, and it doesn't affect anything else, and your saturation is now down. If you want to introduce that saturation and bring in more color, you just increase that saturation a bit. And then on top of that, you can also use this contrast checker, and when you press play on this, the way the contrast checker works, the way it's designed, is It's a very technical term for, it just basically brings in a gradient map to turn your image into black and white, and then a curves adjustment layer so that you can go into this curves adjustment layer and make individual curves settings to brighten and darken your image based on how you want it to look at in black and white, and then you would just take that gradient map off, change that to luminosity, and now it's only affecting your tone and not your color. And again, that might be too much, so you can just go into that opacity and drop that opacity down, and now it's not affecting that image so much. So let's look at another photograph where we're doing pretty much the same process, but really opening up a room and making that room glow. All right, so here's all the work on this image. We've got the digital zone system down here. Let me just turn the eyeball on to this. We've got the, take all these off. So I use the digital zone system first to get my tone right. Then I use my color zone system to get my color right. Then I did some color grading to this photograph, then dodging and burning, then sharpening, then hue saturation to bring out that Christmas tree, and then I went into Topaz Glow to get this nice glowing effect. And you can see what this image is before, without the Topaz Glow. It's not as compelling as it is with the Topaz Glow. And why? That's because what we're doing is we're allowing our eye to bounce from highlight to highlight to highlight. All right, so let's go ahead and see how we do this. We're going to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E to make a stamp of everything below, just like we did in the last layer. And again, we are not going to concern ourselves too much with what exactly the glow looks like, but more importantly, what the finished product is going to do. Because here's something interesting. All of these neon effects, when I first jumped in here, I was like, why would I ever use that? Well, if you use Blazing Neon 1 and you go to Screen, anything that is black is going to disappear. And look at that. Look at those highlights. And that is just crazy. And then if the color is something that you don't like, well, you just go into there, go into the finishing touches here, or the color, I should say, and drop that saturation all the way down. And now what you're doing is just adding a nice highlight line around things that would look good with a pretty neat highlight. Or we can drop that strength down a little bit, so now we just have these very nice highlight touches around certain parts of our photograph. And anything that is in this neon section, we can do that with. We can change that to Screen, because with Screen, anything that's black is going to disappear, and it's only going to leave the overlay of color. So what I like to do with these room glow settings is, here's my room glow setting. Let me go ahead and get my image back to where it should be. So here's my room glow setting. Again, not even a very good setting for a fractal piece. But if I change this to soft light, look at what it's doing. Look at that glow effect that it makes. And basically all the controls for this glow effect come from the glow strength, the simplified details. If I have the simplified details down, it doesn't give me that strong, powerful glow. It just makes everything really detailed looking with a glow effect. So if I bring the simplified details all the way up, it gives me that nice, subtle haze over my entire photograph. And then in the secondary, that was the secondary glow. In the secondary glow, we use the secondary glow to control what's going on with the highlight glow. If we change that to dark, it's going to give us a not so much of a bright glowing glow to our photograph, but it's going to subdue all of the power from our glow type here in the primary glow. So if we use that glow type as light and we use this glow type as dark, it's just going to refine the glow that we're seeing in the primary glow. If we change this to light, again, it's going to be a burst of light pretty much everywhere. But again, we can change these settings by dropping this strength down a little bit or increasing that strength just a little bit. So that's how you can make those rooms just glow a bit. So how do you build this? Well, you just change that preset to soft light. You can use any preset in glow if you want to and just change it to soft light. But what I like to do is actually affect that glow using the different sliders to see how much power do I want to my photograph. So one thing about Topaz Glow is what makes this different than anything you can do in Photoshop. Well, if you are in tune with Photoshop and you know how Photoshop works, and you've seen what's called the soft light glow. Basically what you do is press Control, Shift, Alt, and E, make a stamp, change this to soft light, and then you just go to Gaussian blur, and you do a really powerful Gaussian blur. I mean, you just blur the junk out of your photograph. It creates a very similar glowing effect, but with no control. So here it is, before and after. It doesn't give you the control that you have with that Topaz Glow control. I mean, there's much more control there. You can itemize essentially what you want your glowing effect to do to your photograph. One more thing I want to show before we wrap up is portrait work. I was just playing with this. This is kind of an impromptu thing. It was one of those, I didn't really think I would use it on portraiture, but it added what looks like a nice, almost like I had another speed light on the scene, or I increased the light quality from my speed light on the scene. So here is a photo of my firstborn about 3 years ago, and we were doing a Christmas photo shoot, and he yawned, and it was the best picture out of the entire series. So what I did was I was using a gray background, not a very good background, but what I did was I segregated the background from the foreground and then use Topaz impression on that background. So if you don't have a studio with all these crazy backgrounds, don't worry about it. Use what you have and then use Topaz impression to fake it. Or you can even use a texture. Drop a texture in there and Topaz impression it. Fake it till you make it, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'll just make that stamp again. See how important the stamp is. Control-Shift-Alt and E to make a stamp of that layer. Go to Filter, go to Topaz Labs, and go to Glow. And I'm basically going to use that exact same idea that I did with the room glow. Change that to soft light with that room glow. And then when you go into that preset, actually go all the way down to the color and just drop that saturation all the way out. So it's not affecting color, it's only affecting tone. And when you use the secondary glow as dark, then you really get to kind of pair and tailor how much the glow effect is going to take. So let's just change this to normal so you can kind of see how like that dark look is wrapping around some of the details in the image. So when that's set to soft light, anything that is darker than 50% is going to darken it. Anything that is lighter than 50%, it's going to lighten and never get to 100% black and never get to 100% white. So with Topaz Glow comes the importance of using the blending options along with it. So if I change that glow strength down on just that dark, it's not quite as powerful. But when you look at this photo, it's almost like I increased the light coming from that softbox on the left-hand side another stop or two, whether I did or didn't, whether it's on scene or off scene. And again, if it's too much, just drop that strength a little bit. And now you have a much better looking portrait with what would be more, I guess, clean light. So the biggest takeaways here in the very end of all of this is don't think so literally about the tools that you have, whether it's Glow or any other tool that you have in your toolbox. Don't think about it literally. Think about ways that you can think outside the box to make a photograph better. Because at this point, with Topaz Glow, what I'm getting with these blending options is the ability to create my own highlight effects on my photographs that I've never been able to create before. So I've been using Photoshop for about 15 years, and one of the biggest things that you have when it comes, when in the very end of the day, when someone looks at your photograph, they're looking at areas that are sharp, they're looking at areas that are saturated, and they're looking at areas that are highlights. Those are the areas that the eye is going to hit the most, and if you know that, you can manipulate the viewer to seeing the things that you want them to see and directing their focus to those areas. So Glow gives me maximum control over my highlights.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been great. It's been a ton of info. I have several people saying, woof, we're going to have to watch that again. There's a ton of information, but everyone seems really excited that you were able to cover so much. So thank you very much for going through all those different workflows.
Not a problem. I'm going to have to rewatch it too. So
That's what I said. I was like, I'm going to have to rewatch this as well. So thank you so much, Blake, and happy holidays to everybody.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.